In this video, we're going to be talking all about aftermarket exhausts. All the things that you should be thinking about before spending your hard-earned dollars on a new setup. Hey everyone, Jason here, and in today's video, we're going to be chatting all about aftermarket exhaust setups. We're going to split the video into two sections. The first part, we're going to talk all about noise and sound profile. And in the second part, we're going to talk about different aspects of performance related to exhaust systems. But before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about my own history with performance exhaust systems. When I first got my FRS, one of the first modifications I made was to add a parent exhaust system, a Catback exhaust. And it's probably one of the most common modifications that a car enthusiast will make because a Catback exhaust gives the car a lot of character. It gives it a nice bit of a grunt, a little bit of feedback as you're revving it out. So I went with the parent system because I wanted a bit of a weight reduction, and I really like the hardware that they package with the kit, especially the band clamps, which allows you to adjust the Catback exhaust for alignment, which is especially important if you're a real stickler for making sure that your exhaust tips are balanced and symmetrical. And now here comes the problem with exhaust setups. Once you make one modification, you're already thinking about what's next. And this was around the time when off-the-shelf tuning products for the FRS was coming to market, and the open flash tablet was probably the most popular of the bunch. With that came a stage 2 tune that required catless headers. And of course, I decided to order the open flash headers so I can get rid of the torque dip that the FRS was notoriously known for. And when I had installed the headers in addition to the parent exhaust, and by the way, this was the 3-inch variant because why not? I realized that the exhaust was already starting to get way too loud. At this point, I was looking for other alternatives for the catback portion and actually decided to swap out the parent 3-inch for an NVIDIA Q300. And the Q300 was what everyone was recommending if you wanted to actually reduce the noise of your exhaust setup. The problem with the Q300 is that it still weighs a lot, and I really wasn't a fan of the way that they connected the different pipes. I actually had to deal with a few exhaust leak issues between the mid pipe and the axle back portion. So after rolling with the Q300 for a while, I started to shift the car towards being really track oriented, so weight savings was top of mind, and decided to swap out the Q300 in favor of a Tanabe Concept G single exit exhaust. Fast forward a few years and really going hard with the track days, wanted to add a bit more power to the platform with a supercharger and went with the Jackson Racing kit. And at the same time, I decided to swap out the headers for the Ace headers. And to attenuate the noise from this, I decided to go with a dual resonated front pipe just to get as much noise reduction as I can. Now, I have to admit, with this setup, it's pretty embarrassing to drive around town. I'm not the type of person that's looking for that kind of attention, but at the same time, I don't want to unnecessarily hinder the performance of the vehicle. So that's pretty much where we are today. I literally just drive the car from the garage to the track and back because honestly that's all I can really handle in terms of the comfort, not only from the exhaust but from the ride and the clutch and everything else just related to owning a track car. So let's talk about sound and noise. If you're looking for your first exhaust modification, most of the time you're probably looking for a catback exhaust. If you're disciplined and can really convince yourself that that's all you're going to change, most cases you're not going to have a problem. If you are of a performance-oriented mindset, you're always going to want to add that header, you're always going to want to add that front pipe. The problem with this situation is that the catback is the biggest lever that you have to control the overall noise of the system, and if you try to pick something that you like right from the get-go with your catback, it's almost inevitable that once you modify the front pipe and the header, that it's going to be way too loud. In terms of catback systems, there's usually, I would say, two different variations. One which maintains more of an OEM-like muffler system. These are typically heavier and they do control noise much better than the alternative, which is typically a canister single exit style exhaust. The canister types are often much lighter, which make them really attractive for a track or performance oriented vehicle. When you start moving more upstream from the catback, you now have options in terms of resonator setups or catalytic converter setups. It's very common to remove one or two catalytic converters for a track oriented car, and we'll talk a little bit more about this this later on in the video in terms of the performance implications, but they do have an impact on noise as well, typically making the overall volume louder, as well as adding potentially a raspy note to the sound. When it comes to performance, it's important to note that the changes in the physical components of the exhaust itself is usually not what is yielding your biggest gains. Typically, when you're modifying your exhaust system, you're improving flow as well as the ability to dissipate more heat throughout the entire system. By having better flow and lower heat, this allows tuners to increase the timing of the engine, as well as potentially increasing the boost coming from a turbo setup. It's always recommended that if you're making upstream exhaust modifications, that you should likely go hand in hand with a new tune. There are a couple of things that you can watch out for in terms of optimizing performance when it comes to flow. A very common part to examine would be how your manifold merges into a single or dual pipe. For example, from a 4-cylinder motor, you will often hear of either 4-1 or 4-2-1 collectors. And what that alludes to is whether the 4 exhaust ports are merging directly into one collector, or do they first pass through a dual collector and then down to a single collector. I would definitely try to look online for photos of how this merge occurs. You can see some really big differences between the quality of the welds that are being placed into these collectors and whether they promote good flow through the system. Better flow means lower heat, means more timing that can be pushed from the motor. With this in mind, catalytic converters are typically a restrictor when it comes to flow, and that's why it's very tempting to remove them when it comes to getting more performance out of your exhaust. A couple of things you need to consider with respect to catalytic converters. Clearly, there's a legal constraint, and it definitely can produce a smell that can be quite nauseating to you as the driver, and especially to anyone who's going to be behind your vehicle in stop and go traffic. Another part of the performance equation when it comes to exhaust systems is actually the overall weight reduction. So if I were to count up all the pounds that were saved from my exhaust setup, I believe it'd probably be in somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 pounds from catback to front pipe to manifold. Some of the weight savings will be the removal of heat shields from various parts of the exhaust, but typically most of the weight is going to come from your catback system, especially if you're coming from a full OEM style muffler setup to something like a single exit canister style setup. When it comes to exhaust, you can also move to more exotic materials such as titanium, but from my experience, you'll deal with things like cracking at welds, as well as just a louder noise profile when it comes to comparing stainless steel to titanium. One last area of performance that is often overlooked when it comes to aftermarket exhaust is actually aerodynamic impacts. And usually aerodynamics are actually negatively impacted when you move to an aftermarket setup. Where we often see issues is actually at the muffler in a catback system. The OEM style mufflers, you'll notice, are usually a elliptical shape that's fairly smoothed out at the bottom. Essentially, these muffler systems are acting like a small diffuser to keep the airflow smooth underneath the vehicle. When you remove this large body from the underside of the car, you typically will create a parachute effect when air is flowing through this section at high speeds. So if you're tracking your car and you've moved to a single exit setup, I would highly recommend that you look into getting a diffuser to cover this negative space so that you reduce drag and prevent the creation of a lift pocket for the rear of the vehicle. So that kind of wraps it up for this short video. In summary, if you're just after a sweeter exhaust note, and you have no intentions of ever tracking your car, then a catback exhaust might be the best solution for you. If you are after maximum performance, I would highly recommend that you build your exhaust from the header or the manifold back, as that's where most of your gains are going to come from performance. And at the same time, you'll be able to control and slowly step up the noise profile of your exhaust by building front to back, so that you can decide when it's time to call it quits in terms of what a acceptable level of noise is for your setup. Exhaust can be a pretty touchy and personal subject when it comes to tuning cars. So I'd love to hear about what you guys have done in terms of modifying your exhaust and what kind of journey you've been on to get to that perfect note. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. We'll see you next time.